6 months, Microsoft and the ODI have hosted a peer learning network of organizations who steward open data. Over this time, we've explored topics such as the impact of open data, the organizational governance of open data institutions, business models and how to achieve sustainability, as well as how to make data accessible for a wide community of users. In this roundtable discussion, we'll go one step further by looking beyond the here and now to explore what the future looks like for organizations who steward open data. And so it's my pleasure to welcome 3 experts with me on the panel from the Peer Learning Network. Maryana Pinchuk, the Principal Partnerships Manager at the Wikimedia Foundation, Laureen van Breen, the Managing Director of WikiRate, and Katie Shaw, the Chief Program Officer at Open Apparel Registry. Welcome, ladies. So my first question, throughout the event was responsible data stewardship. How do you interpret that as organizations that collect, maintain and publish open data? And Maryana, could I put that question to you first?
Sure, absolutely. So at the Wikimedia Foundation, it is our mission to empower people all over the world to share their knowledge and to support readers in any language and in any part of the world to access that knowledge. So for us, being responsible data stewards means a few things. It means responsibly stewarding the data, of course. It also means protecting the contributors, the actual people who volunteer their time to make this data available, sometimes working in very adverse conditions in parts of the world that are not very friendly to open knowledge sharing. It also means supporting the broader ecosystem that makes this all possible. So supporting the free and open internet that allows us all to do what we do and is by no means a guarantee to last forever.
Thank you, Maryana. And Laureen, can I put that question to you next?
Yes, sorry. I'm in a lobby of a hotel. I'm on the go, so I hope my internet connection holds out and that you can hear me well. If you don't, please interrupt me, and yeah, we can try again. But yeah, so Maryana already covered a lot of really important points here, and what I would just add is that trust is really important here. So both trust in the data that we steward and trust that we protect the privacy of our contributors and our data users. So for the last point, the privacy of our users, it's really about tracking as little information about them as possible. So you need to track a little bit to understand their use of the platform and if our tools are meeting their needs. But as much as you can, less is more. So that's a really important first part. And the second thing there is that transparency all the way as much as you can around your data to really build that trust in the data that you have. So what we do is we store information all the way down to its source. So where is the information coming from? Having hard copies of that so people can always go back so they can review whether that information is accurately represented. Different levels of verification and tracking all of the activities that people are doing with that data, which I can get into a little bit more to explain also what kind of data we have. But yeah, and then of course the attribution and citation guidance that we provide so that we can really make sure that when the data is being used by others, credit is given to those who've contributed that information and that it's easier for them to also understand where that information is coming from. So again, building that trust. And I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Laureen. Katie, can I come to you next?
Yeah, absolutely. So picking up actually on a couple of the pieces that Maryana and Laureen spoke about, that trust issue as it pertains to responsibility is really important. And a word that we use a lot as an organization at the Open Apparel Registry is neutrality. And that might seem like a slightly abstract word to have honed in on, but for us, when I think about the way that we gather, steward and display data, we have to be as trusted by major global brands in the apparel sector as we are by tiny civil society organizations operating on the ground in production countries. And so for that reason, that neutrality is really important to build and maintain that trust. But another thing that we talk a lot about is that we have to focus on non-controversial data points. because again, that's a really important part of enabling that trust and maintaining that trust. And through those non-controversial data points, we need to be really careful about not unintentionally bringing harm. So this really speaks to that piece around responsible data stewardship. So we would never want to end up in a position where, with the best of intentions, we unintentionally brought harm on some of the most vulnerable communities operating in our world, which at the moment is the apparel sector. So an example to bring that to life is we have a lot of interest in, could trade unions contribute data to the Open Apparel Registry? But there are parts of the world where actually trade unions are very politicized. So if a facility were very openly and visibly connected to a trade union through that data being contributed to the Open Apparel Registry, that might inadvertently put the lives of workers in those facilities in danger. So really thinking through the nuances of what the data points are that you're stewarding, who you're stewarding them for, and how they might go on to be used.
Really interesting. Thank you, Katie. So how has your idea of good open data stewardship evolved over time? So what do you do differently now, say, compared to what you were doing 3, 5, or even 10 years ago? Maryana, could I ask you that question first?
Yeah, so Wikipedia has been around for 21 years now, gosh. And when we first started, it was a very, very small organization keeping sort of the lights on, keeping the website running. And I think over those 20 plus years, we've really come to recognize that our job as the Wikimedia Foundation is more than just running a popular website. What we're actually doing is serving knowledge in a world where there are major existential threats to knowledge, free and open knowledge sharing popping up every day. Things like government censorship and disinformation, and just the changing nature of technology that radically changes the way people can consume and access knowledge. So I think over those years, we've grown a lot as an organization, specifically to address some of those major risks, really beefed up on really critical areas like global advocacy and public policy, user trust and safety to protect our contributors, and in product and technology development to keep pace with the changing nature of how technology is used and how it's grown, so that we can continue to be a viable player in this world and in this game. So yeah, I think really growing and expanding and coming into our own in the broader mission that we have set out to achieve for ourselves.
Thank you. And Laureen?
Right, so around for that long yet. The organization started in 2016 and the platform was only launched in we started in 2013 and the platform launched in 2016. So yeah, we don't have a long track record and we haven't seen very big shifts in the time that we have been around. But what we did learn is that it's really important to explain why what we do should be done by an open data steward. So WikiRate stewards data on company commitments, actions, and impacts on people and planet. And traditionally within this space, that data is referred to ESG data, environmental, social, and governance data. And all other organizations that aggregate this data and provide it to others, they hoard that and then sell that to organizations like investors and companies who, for instance, want to do a competitor analysis. And that means that the access to this information is very skewed to those with deeper pockets. And it means that those are the ones that can then steer companies in terms of what their impacts should be on the world. And so really kind of going through that and explaining that, we've learned is really important. And it's not just about, well, there's really good information here, and once we make it open, everybody will come and use it, right? It's important to explain why not to go for someone who does put up a paywall and why that open data approach is so important here for that access to everyone in that democratic, open way of managing your data. So yeah, that's something we've definitely learned and we can't emphasize enough. Of course, you don't want to get too much into the nitty gritty. We love our own story, but you need to make sure that your audience does understand why that open data steward element is so important in your approach.
Thanks, Laureen. And Katie, I know that Open Apparel Registry is also a very young organisation, but what have the changes been that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will do a plug for our 3rd birthday on Monday. So just a couple of days ago, we turned 3 as an organisation. And actually, I'm going to say something which slightly contrary to what Laureen was just saying, which is that over time, as we've got to know our contributors and our users better, we actually are quite selective and we pick who we message hard on open data to. And that might sound slightly sacrilegious in an ODI summit, so apologies for that. But actually, we work with such a wide range of users, and our contributors and the people making use of that data span the entire globe. And alongside that, have really varying levels of technical exposure, of understanding of data. And so we've actually we're a very practical tool. We're mapping apparel facilities worldwide and allocating them a unique ID. And so similarly, when I think through our engagement with stakeholders and how that relates to sort of good open data stewardship, we're really pragmatic about the entry point that we engage with stakeholders at. And from our perspective, at least initially, it doesn't always matter if some people don't get that a really powerful part of our approach is the fact that we're an open data platform, because if the data is still coming in, and we don't try to mislead people about the ways that the data will be used, we're very transparent in all of our messaging. But actually, if that data is still having the impact that it needs to have in terms of untangling supply chains and helping solve really intractable problems, we don't necessarily consider it an essential part of our mission to educate each and every single person coming to the platform on the importance of open, because it's still working in a way that it would not if it were closed data.
Thanks, Katie. So what are the challenges that open data institutions like yours face, both in 2022 and beyond? And Maryana, I know you've spoken a bit about the challenges already. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I can just say, I think many of the challenges are not new things. They're things that have existed for a long, long time. Things like government censorship, control of truth, global inequities in resources and in access to knowledge have been around. And we continue to face those challenges and continue to see them morphing and evolving into new and exciting, awful things happening in the world. But there are also, I think, interesting opportunities in the realm of new technology. So I think I mentioned a little bit about new ways that people are accessing and consuming knowledge. So what I'm referring to, of course, is the wonderful world in which voice and images and video and AR and now VR are going to be possibly becoming more and more prominent in our daily lives. And I think for stewards of an open data platform that is very, very text heavy, that is a little scary. It's a possible disruption to the model that we've built over the years of getting people to come to our website and read our content and hopefully contribute back into that content, and then also potentially make a donation to the Wikimedia Foundation. So these new ways of learning, new ways of getting knowledge don't really work with that model anymore. But I think there are really, really cool opportunities to think about how to use those new systems, new platforms, new technologies to actually fulfill our mission better, to reach more people where they are, to engage them in the place and the time and the language and the context in which they're in. So I think, you know, with challenges also come really great opportunities to rethink and to grow and evolve.
Absolutely, it's so important to see them also as opportunities. Laureen, can I come to you next on that question?
Yes. Yeah. So as I just mentioned, one of the things for us is that organizations in our space typically sell the data. So one of the issues there is that people find it hard to grasp why we don't sell the data. And it often means that it's assumed that the data is not good enough to be sold, or that there's, for instance, it's unreliable because anyone could have contributed that information, right? So there's all these kinds of questions that for us can be quite challenging to address. And a way in which I like to explain is that we operate in a very capitalist system of sellers and buyers, and we're not selling or buying anything. So it's a very confusing thing for people to find and to come across. And so, it's about having them understand that and then adjust their usual approach and workflow. And that just takes time and effort. So I think that's one of the bigger challenges that we come across, and we will continue to come across as we go about what we do.
Thanks, Laureen. And Katie?
Yeah, so it's kind of an extension in some ways, I suppose, of what Laureen was just explaining. So from our perspective, when I consider sort of challenges that we may be facing in the future, it is the slightly obvious but still important thing to mention, I think, about someone else coming along and doing what we're doing, but doing it in a closed manner, which would dilute the impact that we're having. And to Laureen's point, would it make people undervalue the quality and the purpose that our data is playing in all of this? So that was the first thing that I wanted to mention, that that we have been thinking about and kind of strategizing for. But the second piece is, and again, I think it speaks to some of what Maryana was saying, but there is this issue at the moment around, so there's trust in data, not just the data that we're presenting, stewarding and sharing on our platform, but this piece around data has been so misused by some major global organizations that people are getting increasingly nervous, and rightly so in many ways, about how their data gets used. So is there a piece around saying to people, we're this open data platform, and actually that's in a context and wider understanding of concerns around how data is used and misused? Are people going to become nervous at this concept of open data? And so again, this sort of comes back to this piece around how we're grappling with the need to educate people around open data. And so is it sort of open data for good, or that kind of thing? Just really needing to think through how to help alleviate those concerns that people have about a truly open platform like the platforms that we all work to steward data through, and how to maintain that trust when in a non-open world there are ways that data isn't being used in the most responsible way.
Thanks, Katie. So how do we ensure more fair and equitable data stewardship of open data? Maryana, can I come to you again first?
Yeah, so we think about this a lot since our mission is extremely global. We want to engage everyone anywhere in the world in any language to be a part of our movement. And because we are an organization that essentially works with a huge distributed volunteer community that is present all over the world, we're constantly thinking of ways to engage more people from historically marginalized parts of the world to be a part of our movement and to share their knowledge and to kind of represent their unique view of the world through their eyes. So we've worked on various initiatives to try to engage more people, regardless of what device they're on, their bandwidth and internet connection, to be able to access our information and contribute to it. We've also really worked hard to ensure that representation on our projects of historically marginalized people and knowledge is more equitable. So lots of initiatives in that area. And I think more recently, we've also been thinking harder about governance. So as I said, Wikimedia Foundation is its own entity. All of our volunteer communities are out there in the world. How do we make a better movement that takes into account and leverages the strength of that broader globally dispersed volunteer community and nurtures growing communities in areas where folks are just coming online and just learning about Wikipedia and just getting excited and interested in participating. So we've done a lot just over the past few years to start thinking about new ways to include equity in governance more as a very prominent and sort of first level objective. One of the things we've recently done is kind of redo our grant making funding allocation strategy with this particular concern in mind, that even though we as the Wikimedia Foundation, we give out grants and we sort of have to evaluate programs in order to decide whether they will help our movement and should receive funding. We don't want to do that in a silo. We want to do that with the partnership of our communities, especially if that funding is going to parts of the world where we may not have staff, we don't know the local context, we need more support from the broader global movement to help us make those decisions. And I think over the next few years, we're going to be doing a lot more thinking on the movement governance side in partnership with our communities on how we can better leverage sort of global councils or regional hubs to make the voices of our entire movement more prominent in our governance decisions, and not just the people who have been contributing for 20 years, mainly from the global north and English-speaking countries.
Thanks, Maryana. Laureen, how would you interpret that question?
Right, yeah, so WikiRate exists precisely because the space of company ESG data is inequitable. And that is because most of the information we have on what companies are doing and how they impact the world comes from companies themselves. It's self-reported information. And it's because the data is going mostly to those with the deeper pockets, as I was already saying. So this is why there is a need for an open data steward, and it's why we exist. Company stakeholders are also civil society, academia, the broader public, and they understand also what impact companies have on them and their environments, right? So it's about bringing them into the loop. And these are the biggest users and contributors of our platform to date. But what we've also learned is that there's other under-resourced groups that are really keen for this kind of information as well. And one example is worker rights groups in production countries. And one of the first projects that we have on this, which we're really excited about, is looking at company commitments on supply chain wages in comparison to the actual wages that are being paid in these garment factories where they're producing their products. And this data is now being used by unions and other worker rights groups in those localities to advocate for better wages and working conditions. And this is, of course, a great step in the right direction. We're able to check what companies say with what is actually happening by bringing more diverse voices into that loop. And it is not easy actually working with these groups, is what we're also learning. So it's not so that, you know, Maryana already mentioned it, it's languages. Languages are different, possibly even some illiteracy, different kinds of devices, bandwidths. And so we really need to adapt our approach to fit these groups and their needs as well. And just because we have useful information, that doesn't equate that they can use that information, right? So one of the ways that we're working on this right now is engaging with these groups more directly. We often are, you know, we're kind of that tech and data infrastructure part and we're further removed, but we want to engage with them more and bring them in an earlier stage so that we better understand their needs and can build our structures to serve their needs. But also that we can start to bring awareness to the groups that often gather these data sets and create these data sets so that their needs are considered in the design of that data collection. And that's really our first step. But what comes after that is how can we make it possible for them to also add data to a system like ours, right? How can we bring their voice and make their voice more heard here? And this is actually something that investors are particularly interested in. How can we at scale understand what other company stakeholders have to say about their impacts? But it brings a whole nother set of challenges. So it's around the privacy of workers, worker rights groups. It's around standardization, but also trust. Again, there's a lot of initiatives that have already collected data from workers, but then they didn't actually gain much from contributing that data and putting their time into it, or even that information was used against them in the end, or had a negative side effect for them. So I think it's a longer process, and it's a very exciting journey for us, and we're very keen to see what we can do with that in the years to come.
Thank you, Laureen. And Katie, can I put that question to you? But actually, before I do, if you could just also, I've seen a question in the chat, define what you mean by non-controversial data, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with that. Thank you, Sonia. So I'll just sort of reiterate the context for why non-controversial data points are really important for us as an organization. So this neutrality for us is really important. And so we get a lot of requests to add additional data points to the Open Apparel Registry. We started with a very razor-like focus on the name, improving the quality of data, of name and addresses of facilities, of apparel facilities around the world. And that might seem like a really basic entry point. But when we first built the Open Apparel Registry, we had this hypothesis around the quality of that data being low, and that if you elevated it, you could start to see all sorts of improvements in supply chain. So name and address, arguably, completely non-controversial data points. For those of us that remember phone books, it's phone book data that we are just stewarding and standardizing and making openly available, and then linking back to OAR IDs. As we have added to those data points, we have again, so just last week, launched a big development where we're now accepting contributions and enabling users to search by number of workers, by type of product being manufactured in a facility, by the type of facility and the type of processing, so what's going on in that facility. And again, those are non-controversial data points. We are not entering a world where we're starting to display data on audit reports, or where there have been, we don't flag with a big red marker that there have been supply chain abuses at a particular facility reported, or anything like that. So in terms of the data that we steward and make openly available, it's an ever-growing set of non-controversial data points. But what we do is we enable that access for others to then use in the means which are most appropriate to their organization. And that can be to improve operational efficiencies at major global brands and retailers, but it is also used to advocate on behalf of vulnerable communities, whether that's communities in the social or environmental sense in supply chains. But in terms of what we're presenting to the world, it's non-controversial data points. And actually, I can probably sort of bounce off that back into the answer to the original question, Sonia, if it's helpful. So again, a part of the way that we're ensuring equitable data stewardship through our platform, there's a lot of similarities with what Laureen was describing around our global range of users. So, we think a lot about what's the experience of search and contribution on a mobile device, what languages are we making our content and our user guides available in. So it's not just a case of, switch the language of the site via Google Translate. We're starting to publish a lot more content in different languages. We've begun to hire in-country community managers in production markets. So how can we work with stakeholders on the ground? At the moment, it's India and Turkey, and we hope to grow that part of the team so that users in production markets can start to get access to our data. And that comes back to this really basic but important point that we are committed to any organization or individual being able to access data on global apparel supply chains and unique identifiers for each of those facilities for free. But one point I will mention, and this speaks to another question that I've seen come through in the comments box, there is an element to some of the services that we provide that sort of leans towards a freemium model. So we do have a couple of premium features. One is an API connection, and one is an embedded map functionality. And those are paid for services so that those users who are able to pay, who have the funding and the technical infrastructure to programmatically connect via API, can do that. And that is one part of our revenue stream that enables the free access for all. But we have a commitment to running a civil society access program. So those organizations who might have the technical capacity but not the funding can apply for free access to our API. And if it meets a given set of needs, then we make that possible, and that's sort of one of the ways that we work to ensure equitable access to that data. And then the final point that I'll make is that we've touched a little bit on governance in this, but that's a very, very important part of both our identity and how we're ensuring that fair and equitable data stewardship. So we're a nonprofit registered in the US, and we have a multi-stakeholder board of advisors, so spanning all of the different user groups that make use of the Open Apparel Registry. So we have a major global brand and retailer on the board. In Apparel, we love a multi-stakeholder initiative, so we've got a couple of those represented on our board, but we've also got civil society representation and open data expertise, courtesy of the ODI's Jack Harding. But that multi-stakeholder board structure is really important for us, and actually the beauty of our board is that they don't always agree, which can be challenging, but it is ensuring that we are really thinking through with every decision that we make, that we are representing the needs of our whole range of users, and that it's not just about that in that way we are still driven by that mission and centered in open access to data.
Thanks, Katie. So we're running into our last 5 minutes. Is there anything you'd advise new open data stewards to consider? So are there new opportunities for organizations making data openly available that perhaps wouldn't have existed a few years ago? And Maryana, can I come to you first on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all been building a beautiful, virtuous circle of an open data digital commons. All of our organizations that contribute open data into the world are there and available to be reused for any purpose. Please remix our content, reuse it, get to know it, plug into our linked open data repositories. I think WikiRate is doing some stuff with Wikipedia, which I love. Always love to see that. But yeah, I think that's an opportunity that hasn't existed for very long, and I think the more we all contribute back into our kind of collective pool of open data and open knowledge, the richer we make that ecosystem for the next set of people who come along and build new things off of that platform.
Thank you. And Laureen?
Yeah, so my advice would be also not to just look at organizations in your own domain, but look around at other initiatives and in other spaces. There's lots of open data initiatives out there, lots of stewards, and they've been around for a while. So they have taken very conscious decisions on why they do things a certain way. And you can learn a lot from that. So one of the things is it doesn't have to be that you're dealing with the same type of data. I would give an example, which is GBIF. They're an open data steward that works with biodiversity data and mostly working with visuals and images. So it's very different from what WikiRate does. But at the same time, we've learned a lot through the peer learning network, where we got to know them and learn more about their approach, for instance, around attribution and citation and showcasing the work of their contributors. And this has been really helpful for us to also make our systems more robust and to really build that trust and incentivize contribution. So yeah, don't just stop to look at, because for WikiRate, for example, it would be really easy to just look at other ESG data providers and build off of that and say, but then we'll do the open data approach. But there's so much more to learn. So yeah, don't think too small, go broad. And at the same time, take it step by step. We have big missions, big ambitions. So you don't need to be at your biggest, best self on day one. Just start small and go from there.
Thank you, Laureen. And Katie?
Yeah, so the 2 points from me, and again, this speaks to the question that Matt asked in the chat. It is important to think about your financial structure from early on. So from our perspective, what seems to be working, and this speaks to your point, Matt, around we have a mixture of philanthropic and those paid for services. So really thinking about that from early on, because you will reach a point quite quickly if open data is being stewarded well, where people become dependent on that data. And so it would, it would be a terrible thing if that dependency was developed, but then the financial structures weren't in place to maintain it. And then the final piece that I wanted to mention, it's similar to what Laureen was saying, use the network. I think I've worked in nonprofits for a long time, and something that I've always loved about that space, and I'm finding to be true in the open data world as well, is that it's probably a slightly crass way to put it, we're not all on the make. We were all sort of stewarding data for sort of higher purposes. And so actually what my experience has been is that people are very generous with their time and open to supporting others kind of going on an open data endeavor. So really tap into that generosity of spirit that I have found to exist in this space.
Thank you, Katie. And I think we're at time. So thank you so much to my excellent panel. You've left us all with a lot to think about in relation to the future of open data. And thank you for everyone for joining. So back to Jack, I think.
Thank you, Sonia, and all for such a rich conversation. I was in the background nodding and stopping myself from jumping back in. So thanks again for joining us.